So for those of you that are back for part 2, you're brave, okay? And for those of you that are just joining us, welcome. This session is called Regional Ministry in Canada's Census Metropolitan Areas. And what we looked at in the first part was, what does it mean to engage our census metropolitan areas in an authentic missional engagement? And I put the accent on how networks of churches can take their city regions seriously. So in the first part, we looked at 3 things that are going on in our cities across Canada, primarily inspired from the 2011 census data. The massive level of changes going on in our cities, particularly because of economic pressures on our large cities in Canada. Second of all, we looked at the polarized social landscape, particularly around issues on pluralities and the secularity of our cities. And then finally, we looked at the geographic disbursement of poverty that's going on in our cities. And then that led me to make 3 comments about things that we need to be doing if we're going to take our cities seriously. We need to study place. Study our neighborhoods, our communities, boroughs, city regions. It's called place. We need to study space. The ideology, the worldviews, the world and life perspectives, what I call the social imaginary of our communities. And I highlighted what we call in social terms 5 heavy tendencies that are affecting how people in Canadian cities are thinking and living. And then third, we talked about what do these collaborative networks need to do. And I put the emphasis on 3 things. These networks need to be intentionally interdenominational, ecumenical in the best sense of the word. These networks need to be intentionally collaborative in working with other social service agencies in the neighborhood and in the borough. And then finally, these networks need to be intentionally equipping and deploying volunteers to work in our neighborhoods for the peace and well-being of the city. Now, constantly, we were looking at what is the goal. And for those of you that have a copy of the brochure, on the back side, there are 12 indicators of a transformed city. And so I explained how any church, any network of churches can begin to visualize what needs to happen if committed Christians are going to take in concerted actions the transformation of their borough, of their neighborhood. And I just gave an example through the brochure of what we're doing in our neighborhoods. Now, I also mentioned that there's a good resource available. It's a CD-ROM called The Gospel in Urbanization, and I have copies of this available. There's plenty of resources on this CD-ROM that will give you the biblical basis of this engagement, lots of practical articles on how to study your neighborhood, how to think about it. This is a CD-ROM because it actually is 3,500 pages of articles, and you would not want me to show up with a book with 3,500 pages. And this CD-ROM sells for $15, and if you want to get a copy of it at the end, come see me. And this will be of a great resource to you. Now, that's kind of what we covered in the first part. Let me, in the second part, we're going to get into some questions, get some questions and answers, because there's some questions that we left unanswered in the first part. But let me just give you a couple of illustrations of what networks of churches working in collaborative arrangements with social services in their neighborhoods are doing. And let me base some of my illustrative material here from what we're doing with Christian Direction in different city regions around Quebec. But I can tell you a couple stories of things that I know are going on in other areas. And there might be even some of you that are involved in networks in your neighborhoods, and it would be good to hear your stories. Let me give you a couple of examples. I mentioned in the first part that one of the great epidemics in my culture and in my city is high school dropout. The numbers are numbing in Quebec. Depending on the neighborhood, for example, the neighborhood where I go to church that I help pastor, where my wife is the community development organizer, in 2006, 53% of the boys that started high school that year didn't finish within 5 years. In terms of globalization and how important education, particularly high school education, is, high school dropout for boys is a numbing problem. With both the Protestant and Catholic churches in that neighborhood, we started a center for kids that are at risk of dropping out of school. It's a little bit the bias we have at Christian Direction for kids, and we know in light of that problem, we've just developed an expertise. So we started this program, but what we decided is that we were not going to start it on our own. We joined another social service agency that is a non-faith-based, non-Christian agency, but we created a partnership agreement with them. They were really good at working with children from 1 day to 12. Our expertise is 13 to 18. So it was a kind of a marriage made in heaven. Started to do advertising in the neighborhood, began to attract kids. First thing to always keep in mind in working with kids, don't do things for adolescents, do things with adolescents. Don't do it to them, do it with them. And so these kids painted their room, they picked the name of their center, they told what type of programs they wanted on their computers. We told them which type of programs we would not put on the computers. And we began this cooperative agreement. This center is pretty well situated in the neighborhood, but we also realize that sometimes you can't have kids come to your center. Sometimes you got to take your program to schools. And so now we have about 50 to 60 kids every week involved in an after-school tutoring program to help kids stay in school. Along with other agencies in the community, we've seen that school dropout rate drop by 6% in 6 years. Now, we don't take the credit for that, but we say we're one of the forces. But here's where the good news is. This is a community of 50,000 people. If you added up everybody who goes to a Christian church on a weekend, whether it be a Saturday night service or a Sunday service, there are less than 1,700 people in that community that go to church on a weekly basis. In other words, the church is incredibly marginalized in that neighborhood. Now, in a lot of ways, the church marginalized herself, but you see where you got to come from in a neighborhood like that. It has taken us from 2006, but now the church is recognized through this network as an equal partner in pursuing the peace and well-being of the neighborhood. That's the language we use, peace and well-being. Now, you can hear biblical notions there. Peace is the shalom, reconciliation. Well-being is the reign of God, the rule of God, the kingdom of God. Now, if you were to tell a high school principal or a municipal councilor or a bureaucrat, we're here pursuing the shalom and the rule of God in the neighborhood, they're going to kind of look at you weird. Like what planet are you guys from? So we just find synonyms. We talk about pursuing the peace and the well-being of the neighborhood. And it's opened up all sorts of doors. To the point now where the social service agencies come to us and say, can we house our programs in your churches? Now, it took us 8 years to get there. It's not heaven on earth yet, but at least we've turned the corner. This is a neighborhood that is incredibly poor. I'm still in this first illustration, but I want to get to a question that John asked me. As I said in the first seminar, we Canadians, we love to study ourselves. We are myopic. Census Canada is a huge industry in this country. I say, let's use the data for the mission of God in our neighborhoods. If you go back to the 1871 census, It was the first census that Canada ever took on herself when there were only 4 provinces. You would find out that this neighborhood called Hochelaga Maisonneuve is the poorest borough in Canada going back to 1871. Now, there are neighborhoods that are poor. I mean, we can go to East Hastings if you want to see a poor neighborhood in Canada. You can go to the north side of Winnipeg if you want to see a poor neighborhood. Well, I'm not just talking about a neighborhood. I'm talking about a borough. If your borough has been poor since 1871, you are now talking about intergenerational poverty. You're talking about almost a fatalistic approach to life. In this neighborhood of 50,000 people, intergenerational poverty, I'm glad you're all sitting down but me, there are 200 federally and provincially and municipally funded social service agencies in that neighborhood. 200. So when Christians come into my neighborhood and say, Glenn, we heard what you're doing, we want to start, I stop them. I say, don't start anything. This neighborhood doesn't need another startup. Let's join what's here and let's contribute to the peace and the well-being. So that's another reason why you need to know your neighborhood. What's already going on?
What is that area I'm talking about? Where is it in Quebec?
Right below the Olympic Stadium. Just below Sherbrooke Street, Hochelaga Maisonneuve.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. But this intergenerational poverty thing really started to get to us. And again, it's part of the welfare mentality, the let's solve problems by throwing money at it. Okay, it's endemic to our country. So we decided, now I come to your question, John. We decided that we have to break the cycle. We have to contribute to that. So we had a graduate student who was doing her master's work in international economic community development. And Julia decided that she wanted to work with the kids in our after-school program. So one day she showed up, had the kids in a big circle, and she had a check for $100 on her lap. And she said, there's a group, some of you might know it, called Opportunity International. They want us to start a project. They've given us $100 to start off with, and they want to see us multiply it, and then all of the profits we're going to send to help kids in Colombia. Well, I mean, those kids were less than after that $100, but they really liked the challenge. They decided that they wanted to start a fine chocolate business. Julia's intention was to teach financial capability. Those kids had $100. They wanted to start a fine chocolate operation. So they leveraged the $100, and based on $100, they were able to borrow another $400. They started a fine chocolate company. And they were able to pay off their $400 that they leveraged. They sent $100 back to Opportunity International. And they were able to send almost $500 to Colombia. They learned about leveraging resources. They learned about how to make chocolate. They learned about marketing, sales, hygiene, production, working together. They learned how to keep accounts. They learned how to work together. They were learning the whole gamut, the whole nexus of skills, i.e. financial capabilities, for business. They were delighted. Their first question was, after it was all over, when do we start up production again? So they incorporated their own company, which is now called Chocolat Acma. Okay? So the name of the community with chocolat in front of it. Every 6 months, anywhere between 8 and 12 kids run the company. In an 8 to 12 month period, every one of those kids puts about $600 into their own bank accounts. So they have had to learn now how to negotiate with the local bank, open up an account. They have had to learn how to get loans, how to do inventory. They now do large chocolate sales. They've learned that it's a whole lot easier to sell chocolate on Valentine's Day, Easter, Mother's Day, and Christmas. Don't try and sell chocolates during the summer. It's not worth it. I'll come to that in a minute. They have somebody who manages the money. At the end of every production cycle, they sit down and they give away 10% of their profits. Guess where the idea comes from? And on they go. They have to learn how to set objectives for the company. They have to learn how to set objectives for their own revenue, for what they earn. They know that they can't touch the money until the end of the production cycle because they've got goals. Now here's where the good news starts. They always give 10% away. Last year, 2 of the boys in the project violated their contract. They took the money out of their bank accounts before the end of the production cycle. They got caught. So, my wife, who doesn't run the company but oversees the company, arm's length relationship, called the boys in, and she said, okay, you didn't respect your contract. What are we going to do about it? One of the little boys said, I know what we're not going to do about it. We're not going to tell my mother. And so my wife showed the boys, wait a minute, your parents need to know about this because we have an agreement with the bank that it's your money, only you signed, that's against bank policy, so we got to do something about this. This young little boy is from a Muslim family. He had to go tell his mother. The uproar was unbelievable. His mother came in, met with my staff who oversee the project and my wife, and the mother wanted the little boy kicked out of the project. He's not worthy of doing this. Family shame. If you understand anything about Muslim, particularly Muslim North Africa culture, you understand shame-based cultures. But my staff, the staff woman and my wife said to the mother, no, we're not kicking him out of the project. We believe in second chance. We believe in something called grace. That mother just about fell off her chair. Lots of people, when you hear about social spiritual transformation, say, well, how many new kids are in the youth group? Well, I can tell you about families that are seeing spiritual change through this. These kids do this whole year. They do the winter, spring, fall production. The kids said, what are we going to do in the summer? They decided to start a community garden. Now, this is no community garden. This is a 1,600 square foot community garden. Yeah, wow. And same thing. It's not just about growing vegetables, but it's about a financial capability project. Now,
is the garden operated as a cooperative?
It's not really. It's more as a financial capability project for kids. Now, there's a little bit of a difference. When you make chocolate, there's always, at the end of each production day, immediate gratification. Okay? You get the point. If you plant carrots, you gotta wait a while. So now you've got another thing, because what's life about? It's about delaying gratification. This garden, for the last 2 summers, has employed 10 kids. They have had to do everything from making sure the soil's not contaminated, ordering enhanced soil, building it up, seeding it. It's organic, so nothing foreign into the soil. And then they've got to get the right seeds, do all the watering. The risk factors that you have to factor into your business plan are incredible. Now, what have they done? These kids work with foundations and with major donors, and they leverage resources. These kids now in the summer are making anywhere between $250 and $300. Again, 10% of their profits go to people. Some of the mothers said, wait a minute, we can do this. So now the mothers have started a fine soup cooperative where they make soup in jars with all the lentils in it. Instructions, sell them for $3 to $5 depending on the size of the jar. And now these mothers are banking between $800 and $1,000 every quarterly business cycle. But it gets a little bit more complicated with mothers. Because now you have to teach that you have to record your income against your welfare check.
Yeah.
Oh, now why would we want to do that? Well,
We lose money.
okay, so you got to factor all this in. But you see what you're doing? You're breaking the cycle of intergenerational poverty. You're addressing issues of wealth generation.
Also,
You're doing it in the name of Jesus.
also counteracting the spiritual and emotional poverty.
Well, exactly. Now you're saying poverty is not just about economics. It's about overcoming the idea that I'm nobody. I have nothing to do. I have nothing to offer. You're overcoming, I don't like this person who also is involved in the production cycle. How do I get her out of the project? You overcome issues of punctuality. One time the kids misread an order, and it was a huge order. It was for white chocolate, not black chocolate. So they had to go to the person that had invested and make amends and work out an agreement. Thank goodness for grace. So you see, all of a sudden the stuff you can do when you begin to partner and you begin to think about, okay, what's going on in the neighborhood and how can we bridge it? We have another center, which is right downtown in Montreal. This one's a great community development project because they do cooperative kitchens for immigrant families. And that one is just booming. But then we have another project in the high Muslim part of Montreal. A lot of Muslim immigrants from North Africa who don't have good either French or English skills. So lots of churches do this all over Canada. Conversation cafes, where people have to make a commitment to come. There's no money transactions on these ones. But the emphasis in language acquisition is on employability skills. And we teach how to write a resume, how to interview for a job, but we teach it in terms of mastering French or English in the conversation cafes. You know, what the point I want to get at here is that when you know your neighborhood, you do your assessment, when you understand mindset, when you're motivated by a study of Scripture, seeking for the welfare of the community, it's amazing how creative you can get to not just address needs, how you can develop strategies to meet people's aspirations, their expectations, their desires. If you ever want to know what the desires are in a community, just sit down with a group of mothers and ask the question, what do you want for your children? It's amazing the things you learn. So these things become fun to do. But again, you partner with other agencies in the neighborhood, in the community, to pull this off. So there's kind of a summary about what we did in the first part, but I've tried to tell you some stories to give you some examples. Now let me tell you one other last story, and then we can get into your questions. I told you a lot about what goes on in the community in terms of studying it. Let me go to space mentality. In my city, like in your city, New Age phenomenon, esoteric phenomenon, is not about to die. G.K. Chesterton put it best. When people stop believing in God, They don't believe in nothing. They believe in anything. And so where do a lot of Canadians flock now? Well, just check out the astrology page in your newspaper. That's not gone dead. All sorts of psychic fairs go on all over Canada. They're alive and well in Quebec. So back several years ago, my colleagues were studying this phenomenon, and they found out that in Montreal, twice a year, there's a psychic fair. It's not the occult stuff. It's very much the soft, new age, esoteric stuff. Palm reading, crystal ball gazing, waxing, analyzing your signature, all sort of that stuff. My colleagues decided where the darkness reigns, there the light must shine. So, believe it or not, for the last 20 years, twice a year, my colleagues, again, in partnership with other churches, go to the psychic fair. They pay $450 to have a kiosk at the fair. They don't charge anything. Every one of the other kiosks is charging for, everything from nuts to soup and get your hand analyzed. And they have a kiosk where they offer to pray for people.
Amen.
And we have conversations over a course of a Friday afternoon, evening, all day Saturday, all day Sunday. Conversations with, anywhere between 250 and 300 people. We do follow-up after every fair with anywhere between 10 and 40 people. Get them involved in small groups. The connection after praying with them, people come up. The question is there something I can pray for you? People involved in esoteric phenomenon understand the spiritual world. So the language of prayer is not offensive at all. After you listen to people, pray with them. Bridge question. Have you ever considered what Jesus of Nazareth had to say about prayer? No? Never thought about it. Would you like to know? There's the bridge. This is a service we do in collaborative efforts with other churches. But here's the funny part about it. This is a ministry we want to shut down. We're praying that the psychic fair will close. So we're in the business to see this thing shut down. Okay? Until it's shut down, we're going to be there trying to be the light of Jesus. But why do you do it? Because as you study your neighborhood, as you study your city and you see what's going on, you think, okay, where does the light need to shine? Where is the light not now shining? Now, what's really funny about the psychic fair is that inevitably, to our kiosk, up will strut some Christian, and they'll say, "What are you guys doing here?" Now, the comeback is really simple. What are you doing here? See, because to get into the psychic fair, you have to pay $12.50 entrance fee, and the average person, they get anywhere between 8,000 and 12,000 people every weekend, and the average person spends about $95 once they're in there. So the line really works. What are you doing here? It really works well. So, but again, it's understanding, how do Christians working together find their place in the public space of the culture? All that to say, I think that as we study our neighborhoods, as we understand what's going on, as we understand mindsets, this is going to force us as followers of Jesus to get really creative about how we're going to accomplish God's mission, how we're going to participate in God's mission. And I think we're at the beginning of a new moment in mission in our Canadian cities. There's just so many opportunities. We haven't begun to get close to the bottom of the barrel on the possibilities. Well, let me stop there. That's some of the stuff we covered, plus some new stories. Maybe you got questions or comments. Yvonne.
Just one thing that made me think about, I saw something like that in Victoria for the first time.
Stand up.
Yeah, stand up. Yeah, that's right.
I just want to say that
Come up front so everybody can hear.
I was just saying that it made me think. My name is Yvon. I'm from Victoria. I live in Victoria, but I'm from Quebec originally. And I saw, it made me think about something cool that I saw last spring, at kind of the Earth Day.
Yeah.
Was near, actually, ironically, was near the St. Anne's Academy, one of the oldest historical building of the West. And it was built by the priests and everything. And there was the fair that was there with food, with all kinds of stuff of all kinds, and music. And there was a booth that some Christian decided to put there with different churches, Christian churches, and they were doing that. They were offering prayers, and I forgot now if it was including talks, but I remember it was linked with prayers and art.
Yeah.
Then they were having art for kids, for people to do certain art piece or inspirational, what they wanted to do, and kind of a. And if I remember well, something with healing through art and also offering prayers and everything. And they had the T-shirts and everything. And anyway, I thought it was so cool because they were there involved at doing something. And so that's what you're saying.
Yvonne, that story, thank you. That story reminds me of something. Your city, like my city, has a lot of street people. Marginalized street people, itinerants living in the downtown core, mostly street people. Christian Direction has a partnership agreement with the St. James Drop-In Center. It's a non-faith-based, in spite of its name, it's not a Christian drop-in center. My colleague Bernard is artist in residence at Christian Direction. He's a graphic artist. He's a painter as well as a musician. What Bernard does with that center is he teaches painting to street people. So we don't call it art therapy, but it is a form of art therapy. Art therapy is it's a technical term, so we don't use that term. But that's what he's teaching them painting. But then what does he do? 6 times a year, he organizes art expos where the street guys show their art. Then they sell their art. And with 50% of the proceeds from their art sales, 50% goes back to the center to cover costs. The other 50%, Byrne teaches the guys how to manage their money, get housing, and get off the streets. So there's all sorts of fun things you can do when you begin to get creative and think, again, go back, what's the goal? The goal is social spiritual transformation, the peace and well-being of individuals, their families, and the community. So you're thinking holistically on it. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm not up to date with this, but you probably are l'Église de la Nouvelle Vie.
Nouvelle Vie, yeah.
So I heard about this church about 15 years ago. I went and visited it on Christmas Eve. And they have a tradition, or not tradition, but they have, isn't Quebec known as the most largest television audience in the Western world? Very plugged into TV shows and stuff, right?
Loved it. And all made in Quebec.
They have what they call a variety show, is it Vedette?
Les Vedettes, yeah.
Which they have on television, which are like 1 hour long, right? They're a specific set of time like you have on a television variety show. We don't sort of have them so much, but it used to be a tradition, but they're big in Quebec still.
It's a very strong star system.
Right. Yeah. So first of all, this church, and you'll have to update me because I don't know what's going on now, but we walked to this church. They bought a shopping plaza, a small shopping plaza. And in the shopping plaza, they have a second-hand store boutique, but upscale. I'm not sure if there's anything low style. So their second-hand boutique is probably like top of the line, regular boutiques in Montreal, and in Vancouver. And Épicerie, which is like a little corner grocery store, like a privately owned 7-Eleven, but selling cigarettes and alcohol and that sort of thing, which us Christians, or we Christians out west would say, heaven forbid, why would you rent somebody in a facility like that? But there's a front door and a back door. People come in the front door to the facility, and when they come out the back door into the mall section, there's the church, which was a grocery store. They made a sanctuary out of this thing. And so we come there on Christmas Eve, and there's a jazz band playing, like professional musicians playing like jazz, Christmas carols and Christmas music and stuff like that while we're waiting for the show. And bang, 7 o'clock the show starts, and it's like a 1-hour show on TV, and it's click, click, click. One entertainer after the other. An opera singer sang one song, "Oh Holy Night" or something. They had a Haitian group who were kind of a reggae number. They had a church choir. They had all different styles of music, like a regular variety show you see on TV, and it just moved like clockwork all the way through. The pastor did about a 7-minute or 8-minute altar call type of message, but that's all. That's the only religious part of it. At the end of the hour, bang, show's over, lights went up, was all over. And people would bring their non-Christian family friends to the big Christmas Eve gala. And when the thing was over after an hour, like people were there shaking their heads and saying, "It's over? Bring it on, I'd like some more." But it was finished. It was the 1-hour show. Like, it wasn't any of this kind of long and drawn out thing. And I was so impressed at the time. And then I read this article, which I'm not going to hold forth, but maybe you can talk into, about how that church was used during the Great Ice Storm in the late 90s. And that fits into what you just talked about, dovetailing with the agencies and how initially marginalized because they were a church, but in the end, out of need. You take it from there.
Well, okay. No, I don't need to take it from there. The pastor is a very, very dear friend.
Story. It's like back in the late 90s, there was this tremendous ice storm that hit eastern Canada and New York State. And if anybody recalls, there are pictures of like the hydro tension towers were all like crippled and bent over, and there was no power coming in, and it, like this city.
Oh yeah, it was
a complete crisis.
We just talk about the verglas, as we say in French, an ice storm in Quebec. Everybody panics now.
Yeah. So anyway, they had all of these shelters that were set up by the communities, and that because families couldn't go back to their homes, and of course, cold there is like super cold in the middle of winter, and so you couldn't live in your house, and you couldn't make meals, and you couldn't put heaters on, and they'd all be gathering at these local community centers until the community centers were overwhelmed with people.
Well, let me jump in on that, because that's. I mean, you've told 95% of the story, so I don't need to repeat. But that church is part of our network, and the pastor Claude is a very, very dear friend. It's a church it's quite a large church now, but it's mastered understanding its neighborhood. And it's true. When the ice storm came, January of 1998, that church opened up its building and received thousands of people in the neighborhood. And they had generators, so they provided. And that opened up the door so that now they're recognized for their social service collaboration in the community. So it's, Yeah, John, go ahead. So you got the story. I'll clap for Claude.
Okay, so earlier today I asked you about community volunteerism when you've got the single parent the one parent working. There's no such thing as a one income family now, and then the other parents working part time and taking the kids to soccer and basketball and music and all this stuff. So then, how do you? I'm asking you about like developing a community volunteerism, community employment, all that infrastructure, cooperative.
Yeah. Okay. It's a great question. There's two things that go into this in our Canadian cities right now. The best way to put it, I'd compliment what you've said, is that one income parent families, that is a disappearing phenomenon in Canadian cities. It's disappearing not for part of it is economic pressures. Part of it is women going into the workforce. Part of it is the single parent family. All of that is all part of what's going on here. You can't reduce it to any one thing. When you study your communities, make sure you're studying average and medium revenue in your neighborhood. Okay, average income is all the income in the neighborhood divided by the number of households. That's an important figure to have. But it's not the most important figure to have. The more important figure to have is the median income. What's the 50%? 50% live below, 50% live above. The problem with the average is that it's always going to be influenced by the high end and the low end. Whereas median will find out where the 50% range is. Make sure you get both. Watch the number of households. In the first part of this seminar, I mentioned a phenomenon that has really affected my city. It's happening all over Canada, though. The number of people living alone. That number is like as I already said, 1.8 million people living on the island of Montreal for the almost 4 million that live in the census metropolitan area. But on the island of Montreal, 40% of the people live alone. That's why you've got the dispersion of poverty. There's just, an apartment that used to have 5 people living in it now has 1. Okay, so where do the other 4 go? Dispersion of poverty. Excuse me. Once you know some of these things, this is where churches move into action then. Once they understand revenue structure in their neighborhood, they then can begin to provide services particularly to one-parent families or one-income families. So you get churches that are really getting good and consortium of churches that are really getting good at after-school programs. That helps particularly single-parent families that need their kids to be getting tutoring or help before mom or dad gets home. These are churches that are getting really good at providing transportation services to get to medical appointments, to get to counseling appointments. One of the biggest things we do in one of our neighborhoods is every Friday we provide a nutritional program, including a food service, for 120 families, primarily Muslim immigrants, because it's a high Muslim area. So when churches are working together to provide not just food, food banks are as old as Canada is, but you're moving beyond food banks to talk about what we call now food autonomy, so that you're teaching people not only how to shop, how to cook, how to eat together. I'll come back to that one in just a minute. But you're beginning to provide the whole capability structure around everything related to the family unit. Those are the things that are really getting interesting. Here's what goes into food autonomy. This is something that I think that churches can really get on the front end of. Food autonomy, like financial capability, you look at the whole scope of nutrition. Right from the moment of teaching people how to shop, how to read a food label. One thing that affects a lot of poor economic families in Canada is they only shop for 1 or 2 days at a time. So where do you shop if you're only shopping for 1 or 2 days at a time? Exactly. You go to the corner store. You don't go to the grocery store. How much more does it cost to buy 2 days of food at the corner store as opposed to the grocery store?
Almost 2/3 as much on top of the, 1 and 2/3 as much.
Now, here's what happens in some neighborhoods depending on medium income. Again, we're still talking food autonomy. The banks know this better than anybody. The banks know what happens when people use teller machines and make deposits with empty envelopes. You know that phenomenon? I'm going to deposit a check for $100, except I forget to put the $100 check in the envelope. Okay? Why do banks move out of the neighborhood? They redline neighborhoods. This is an at-risk neighborhood. So we're not going to serve it with a bank branch. We'll just serve it with a machine. The banks move out. So how do you cash your government checks? You go to the grocery store. Now I'm here to tell you, if I put $1,000 into my bank account, as opposed to go to a grocery store and cash a $1,000 check and get cash, I know how quick the $1,000 is going to go. Okay? So food autonomy is also teaching people how to manage their money. Okay, then people come after, do your grocery list, shop for a week or 2 weeks, make sure you use your money appropriately, stewardship. Then we show people how to cook, how to make food for a whole week. But food autonomy is also, think Christianly, how to sit down and have a meal together. And so in every one of our food autonomy classes, we don't just teach everything up to the point of preparing the food, but then everybody in the class has to sit and have a meal together. So you'll learn how to set the table. You ever noticed how kids today don't know where to put the fork, where to put the knife, where to put the spoon? That's just called table etiquette. So you begin to inculcate these notions. We are always struck in a lot, and this doesn't just affect economically poor, it affects the relationally poor. How many families no longer eat together? Okay? Things that you can contribute, again, for the peace and the well-being. So food autonomy becomes a marvelous thing that churches can contribute to the peace and well-being of the neighborhood. Now you bring to the food conversation the spiritual dimension of life. And there's no better place than at the table to do that.